Hello everyone, it is my distinct pleasure to be able to welcome you to the final debate of the 16th International Debate Tournament in Ljutomer. Welcome. So out of the 48 teams from all around the world that we've been competing over the past couple of days, the two that sit either side of me have made it all the way to the final. So could you please acknowledge both USA Red and Logos Bermuda, so Ella Michaels, Rainan Miao, Nikhil Ramaswamy, Taya Kovacic, Vasya Grossel, and Iza Yerman. Please give them a really warm welcome. Before we kick this debate off, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of the organizers that have made the last couple of days a seamless experience from all of us, but also to all of the judges and everyone who has prepared all of you so that you could get here, and especially the two teams that are sitting on either side. There is a huge community that stands behind an event like this, and we should definitely acknowledge and appreciate it. So thank you to all of those people. Without any further ado, however, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Taya Kovacic to open the debate on the motion that this House regrets the privatization of space travel.
Ladies and gentlemen, we owe a lot to space research for the tremendous achievements and developments our planet has seen in recent decades. Major breakthroughs in all spheres of life were made possible because government agencies and programs that are funded by the people and serve the people were the primary actor in the field of space research and travel. But in recent times, we've seen a concerned trend, a trend of privatization. By this being said, I welcome you to today's debate, of which the motion is this House regrets the privatization of space research and travel. And on the side of proposition, we strongly support this motion. Now let's look at the framing of this debate and the current situation in the status quo. The high-risk nature of the industry is unforgiving, and we see that the private companies face tremendous obstacles when it comes to steadily financing themselves in such a volatile field. We see basically governments and government agencies financing, no thank you. We see basically so much money being spent and diverted into these companies, while as a result we're not getting any basically major, no thank you, achievements due to the, due to the nature of these private companies. Ladies and gentlemen, today the side of proposition regrets that these companies are becoming the primary actor in the field that basically largely benefits, and we think that they do not benefit the society as they actually could if they were all government, companies. Today we have two major arguments for you as to why we should regret this trend of privatization. The first one presented by me of how privatization undermines the scientific community as a whole, and second argument presented by my second speaker Vasya about how the impact of privatization acts on a societal level. Now let's start off with our first argument. Now we believe that everyone is aware how vital space research has been in the recent decades in the shaping and developing the whole society. Now the newfound technologies that came directly or as a byproduct from space research, give us tremendous benefits on the field of medicine, for example. You have, for instance, CAT scans, artificial limbs, ventricular assist devices, infrared ear thermometers, you have LEDs, etc., etc. You have, telecommunication, for example, mobile phones and GPSs, and so on and so forth. Now, these newly funded advancements should be public domain and should be put on the free market where it can evolve and bring us even more benefits. Now, while we will explain this dynamic in the second argument, let's look at what happens to this research when it comes to privatized companies. Three layers of analysis here. Firstly, All these private companies are completely profit-driven. Their sole existence is based on them being profitable, which means they just need money, they want the capital, they are basically a bit greedy, we tell you. No, thank you. Private owners and investors do not invest such large sums of money into such very expensive field without them trying to get eventual profit out of it. In principle, this already clashes with what we believe space research and space travel should be. We believe that this should be societal backed because the money will come from, no thank you, the taxpayers' money, and they should give back to the society as a whole and not keep the information for themselves. Now we want the research to be primarily handled by a body whose purpose is to benefit the society, and we believe that that body today, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, should be the government itself and no one else. We've gone decades with governments financing with taxpayers' money, these programs, and we've come far. And whenever, no thank you, a government organization achieves a new breakthrough, it was given back to the society. It was given to the free market, where then the private sector could take this newly uncovered knowledge and develop it even further. But what happens in this case? Firstly, we tell you that the government bodies are by law required to disclose their organizations. That's why we have, for example, the Hubble telescope that has published over 14,000 scientific papers by releasing all newly required data to the scientific community for, mind this, no added cost, which means that everybody was able to freely use the Hubble telescope and the data achieved from the Hubble telescope. Which brings me to my second layer of analysis. Basically, no thank you, why this research is put in harm's way because of the privatization. Firstly, all these private companies are completely profit-driven. So we tell you that when these private companies call business secrets, we call depriving the society of much needed information. We see in the status quo that these companies are largely benefiting from partners with these government agencies, plus the nature of government agencies sharing their valuable information. It has made it very easy for many of these companies, firstly, to catch up in terms of technology. No, thank you. But the problem is that the private sector doesn't share, because it doesn't want to share this information with the rest of the community. Why? Because firstly, on the quest of profit, you don't want to help your fellow main competitors in the race for the newest scientific breakthrough. This is why the companies have this non-disclosure agreement, a legal contract that does not allow the scientists working on a certain project sharing this valuable information with anyone, no thank you, outside of the company, especially not the competitors. Meaning that no other actor could benefit from the actual research that those private companies do. They have basically a legal contract saying that no one can share this information with the rest of the public. No, thank you. You have a non-competition clause that makes sure that not only that people don't share the information with anyone else, but that they also can't work on similar projects with any other companies. We say this is inherently harming the actual society, harming the development and researches that could be done if all was governmentally funded. Now, secrets are always present in business, and we get them even more if we have the private sector. Yes, please.
Do you regret the privatization of the medical sector?
We are talking about specifically the space exploration and travel. This is wrong because all these researches made in the scientific sphere of space research are very important for the whole society. And what are those private sectors do? They are keeping the information for themselves. Basically, on our side, you get governments sharing this information with the public that companies can use as well and can basically involve this further, right, freely. Third layer of analysis, why research doesn't go into the direction that it needs to and it rather does in one that makes profit back to the company. For example, we see Virgin Galactica, which invested $600 million into space tourism because it will get something in return at the end of the day, not society as a whole. They will just get a few individuals who will be able to afford $250,000 tickets to space. We tell you on our side that those companies are basically putting all this work in basically a sphere that just benefits them and not the society. You have the Worldview Enterprises, their latest great achievement was sending a KFC chicken sandwich into space. On our side, we do not want those kind of ridiculous space projects. We want projects that will be funded by the government, with the companies funded by the government. We want actual profit for the society as well. We want societal benefits. This is why we're so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Taya for her speech and call upon Ella Michael to open the case for the opposition.
As long as humans have been able to look up at the skies, we've dreamed of exploring and discovering the furthest reaches of this universe. And because allowing for privatization, competition, and innovation helps us achieve this very end, we're so very proud to oppose. Before I respond to the material that the proposition brought you and introduce our first two substantive arguments, with my partner Rainan introducing our third, I'd like to clarify a couple of things in this debate, namely three. First, what exactly does privatization look like? We think it does look like the rise of corporations like Virgin Galactic and Japanese company iSpace in the private space exploration industry. And we think it also includes public-private partnerships between governments and these private corporations for the mutual gain in space exploration. The second thing we'd like to clarify is that privatization of the space industry is not synonymous with the destruction of the public space industry. We think that these two have distinct and often complementary roles, and to the extent that public programs do struggle, it is not because of the private space industry, and often the private space industry can help fill in those gaps. The final thing we'd like to clarify is the proposition's burden in today's round. It is not enough for them to prove that the public sector is better than the private sector. They have to prove why the private sector is so harmful that we ought to regret its existence altogether. With that, let's introduce some of our responses to the material that side proposition brought you. In their first speech, they basically brought you one idea. Privatization undermines sharing and restricts access to space research. We have three responses to this. First, they talk about all of the beneficial things that the public sector does as compared to the private sector. But note that on our side of the house, we do nothing to prevent public space research from occurring. So all of the medical benefits and innovations that the public sector achieves on their side of the house continue to exist, and as we'll explain in our second argument, are actually bolstered by the existence of the private sector. Our second response is that often privatization is far less restrictive than they would have you believe. For example, SpaceX, one of the most prominent private space exploration companies in the entire world, has not patented a single one of its technologies, allowing access for other researchers to benefit from this kind of technology. So the idea that private companies are exclusively incredibly greedy and just want to restrict access of their technologies from the entire world, we think is a little bit of an extreme characterization. But finally, even if you do accept that private corporations probably decrease access to technologies as compared to public corporations, without these private corporations, those technologies would not exist in the first place. Rainan asked a great POI to their first proposition speaker about whether or not they regret the privatization in the medical industry. And they said no, because space is for the benefit of all mankind. We think that the medical industry is for the benefit of all mankind as well, and we don't think it is practical or principally okay to entrust the government with the entire burden of fulfilling the benefits achieved by the medical industry. Similarly, we think that it is more than okay to supplement the benefits of the private industry in space with the advancements of the public sector. And with that, let's introduce our first substantive argument about how privatization increases innovation. Two layers. First, it increases access to space exploration for two reasons. First, it decreases the cost of space exploration. When companies like SpaceX and Blue Origins have to compete for the same clients and government partnerships, they much increase their chances if they decrease the cost of their technologies that they offer. This incentive to do so doesn't really exist in a world where one single public entity is essentially the only hegemon in space exploration in a particular country. The second reason it increases access is because it creates opportunities for nations that maybe aren't space or global superpowers. Economic powerhouses like China, the US, and Russia are really the only ones that can meaningfully engage in space exploration in a world of exclusively public-dominated exploration, because they're the only ones with the economic resources to do so. Privatization, on the other hand, allows nations like Luxembourg and Australia to also invest in exploring the final frontier because private resources supplement their own public resources. Our second layer under this argument is that privatization increases efficiency. Privatization increases efficiency for two reasons. First, private companies lack the bloated bureaucracies that restrict creative freedom in public spheres, and also they fund and implement projects faster due to these reasons. But second, the chief purpose of a private space exploration company is space exploration. That is what they do, that is what they spend their money on. Such is not the case with a public program or a government for whom space exploration might be an afterthought. Why is this so important? We think that innovation is incredibly important, and we also think that private companies play a unique role because their role is to actually cater to the general good and create technologies for the public interest, while the public sector is focused on education and the military. We think this is incredibly important. Now moving on into our second substantive argument about how private space actors work with, not against, public organizations. But before I introduce that, go.
Okay, so when we compare this efficiency, we have to realize, yes, companies are more efficient in making profit than the public sector, but they are not going to invest into research for the sake of research because research is not profitable.
We don't think that that is true. We've seen companies invest in things like a billion-pixel telescope that allow researchers to see stars outside of our galaxy for the first time ever. That happened only with the advent of privatization. But furthermore, even if they don't necessarily invest in as much research, the innovations in decreasing cost that they pursue are still beneficial and don't take away from the public sector. Our first layer under this second substantive argument is that privatization fills in the gaps. Government programs often come up short, and their fate is uncertain for a couple of reasons. One, the urgency of the space race has slowed, meaning that government organizations have shifted more towards cooperation, so they are less incentivized to cooperate with one another and spend a lot on space exploration. But also, budgetary priorities shift with political tides, and thus, public organizations often aren't able to fund space exploration. Not limiting public space exploration to the public sector means that advancement can still occur even when that sector struggles, which is really important, including for government-funded efforts. Consider cooperation around the International Space Station, which has actually been struggling in recent years because of the struggling fate of American and Russian space exploration programs. Experts predict that private companies are actually going to be the ones to supplement these drawbacks and are actually going to ensure the continuation of these benefits. But our second layer under this argument is that this allows public and private programs to do what they are best at. The true value of public programs, as Proposition points out, is their ability to engage in beneficial research and push educational boundaries. But prior to privatization, large parts of their budget were bogged down by routine application of already established research. But the advent of privatization has changed this. Whereas the old space shuttle program in the United States cost $4 billion each year, contracting out to private companies has actually made costs 10% of this, because private companies shoulder the responsibility of streamlining and improving and decreasing the costs of existing government technologies. Their roles are complementary, they benefit all of space exploration, all of humanity, and that's why we're so proud to stand in opposition. Thank you.
And call on Vasia Groschel to continue the case for the proposition.
As long as humans have been looking up to the skies, they wanted to reach the stars. Yes, but what did they not want to see? They definitely didn't want to see billionaire company owners driving around in their personal rockets on that beautiful sky. And this is exactly what is happening in the status quo, because the research of space and space exploration is slowly shifting towards the private sector, towards greed, towards the only incentive for it being profitability, and that is what we are so against on the side of the opposition. Or the proposition, sorry. So before I continue to our second substantive point, where I'm going to talk about that companies and the private sector actually put a price tag on research and further analyze in depth how they actually have no interest in engaging with research purely for the sake of research, purely for the sake of human development. But before that, I have three major points of negation. The first one being on the side of opposition's point about how the private sector doesn't harm the public sector at all. And they asked this POI, do we not support the privatization of the medical industry? We say absolutely not, because the privatization of the medical industry puts a price tag on health. We believe health should be a universal right distributed to its citizens by their governments, free, rid of the profitable cause, and we believe that this is the cause that we're fighting for, and the same thing would happen with the privatization of space exploration. Because this research we desperately need as mankind. Our society is filled with environmental issues. We have issues with overpopulations. We are in desperate need for new solutions for our global and societal problems, and we believe that governments are much more incentivized and more suitable to provide the technologies, to provide the solutions for those problems without having any profit in mind, while on the other hand, companies, the only thing they do in space is basically the thing that gives them, or actually provides the investors with the return investment. To the second point of negotiation, which is the point of efficiency, where they say that companies are super efficient and how they are actually better at actually producing this research. We say yes. I already told that in the POI. Companies are super efficient only in the examples that profit them. Because, for example, if I'm a company, even if I'm Virgin Galactic, right, I'm not going to simply go and analyze stones on the moon, because that is not going to give me any profit. What I will do, on the other hand, is create a tourist agency that's going to provide me with fast cash for my investors, but it is not going to benefit mankind or our society whatsoever. So yes, they might be efficient, they might be fast, but the cause that they are fighting for is completely wrong. And they're so fast, we believe they're running away, and the fact that privatization is becoming a bigger and bigger prospect in space exploration is extremely worrying and is only magnifying the impact of turning space research into an industry. Okay, so even when they give us the example under the efficiency, they say, well, okay, other space agencies also invest in, space companies also invest in research. They give us the example of the telescope, the multi-billion pixel telescope Gaia, which was actually not even built by a private company due to its own incentive. This was a project that was funded by the European Space Agency that contracted a company to help them with some technological advances. So in themselves, the corporate world never focuses on pure research. They only sniff at the research when it provides a profit. The third and last point I want to talk about in the rebuttal is the fact that they kind of clash with us on the public space research part when they say, well, governmental programs, clearly they are unable to fund, unable to facilitate such development. We say, first of all, right now in the status quo, even in NASA, we have seen budget rises in the last 2 years, so they're getting more finances from the government. No, thank you. They're getting more funds and a bigger budget to actually conduct this research. And furthermore, when they say that the cooperation on the International Space Station is highly compromised because we have so many issues with the Russian and the American space programs, we say that this is simply not true. The cooperation on the International Space Station is in full gear. What is happening up there, the only thing that has changed is the fact that American astronauts now go up to the space station with Russian rockets, the ultimate sign of intergovernmental cooperation. So yes, even in the status quo, those space agencies are able to fund their programs, but what we say furthermore, no thank you, that the fact that the privatized space industry exists, this actually undermines undermines the budgets of national space agencies. Because when the only thing people see in the public sphere is SpaceX doing this, Virgin Galactica doing that, they clearly don't want to focus their political capital on the old school government programs, because what are those people? People like Elon Musk, they're complete showmen. They present people with completely unrealistic goals, get in a bunch of investments, and in the end, their results do not even benefit the public sphere. Therefore, the private sector also undermines the ability of the governments to conduct research themselves. Before I continue, yes?
The very example that you provide about how this multi-billion pixel telescope was made possible by a partnership between the public and private sector underscores the importance of the relationship between these two as collaborative entities, not entities that undermine one another's interests.
Okay, Madam Speaker, if we look at the actual, or panel of judges, if we look at the actual scale on which the private companies actually invest into research and development, the amount of budget that they spend for research themselves as an actor, they spend over 2,000 times more of their budgets and of their finances for space manufacturing and sending up commercial satellites to space than they do on actual research themselves. We said that as an actor that is supposed to facilitate the research and development for humanity so we can tackle pressing social environmental issues, they are not suitable and we do not support them. Moving on to our second argument, putting a price on research. Companies, specifically space companies, are driven by profit because they are engaging in competition within a field that poses a huge risk of failure and is extremely complex. And any chance they can get in order to ensure their profit, they are going to do so. This is shown in the fact that they do spend 40% of their budgets on things that provide them with easy money. For example, sending up commercial satellites, space tourism, stuff like that. And this shows also the underwhelming amount of money they spend on research itself. But furthermore, we say that, for example, space tourism, in that sphere, only Space Adventures has had successful flights, while the other 14 companies that engage in the same sphere are still at the level of development. Clearly, the sharing of technology, the sharing of development is already not happening in the private sector. They have things such as patents, NDAs, which scientists have to sign. So this is basically signing legal secrecy. They have non-competition clauses which say that employees cannot engage in activities in the same technological sphere while they are employed in the company, and also cannot do so even 2 years after they got fired from the company. And even if a bit of technology slips away from their corporate arms and gets onto the market, it is priced at an extreme price. For example, in the medical industry, the production of medicine costs like 5 cents per pack of pills, and what do they sell them for? When we have this privatized, the price is extremely high, even more than 10,000 times its initial value. Putting a price on research is inherently wrong, because this is the research that is supposed to benefit humanity and is the right of every single citizen of the world. For all of those reasons, go for the side of opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasya, for that speech. And we call now Rainan Miao to continue the debate for the opposition.
This debate was not about whether or not public space exploration is better or worse than private space exploration. It's about a comparative between two worlds. One world where there exists only public exploration, and one world where there is both public and private exploration. It's because side opposition believes that private corporations are able to drive us forwards that we are so proud to oppose today's motion. What am I going to give you in my speech today? First, I'm going to refute my opponent's arguments. Then I will extend Ella's beautiful analysis before finally going on to our third substantive argument on how corporations benefit society as a whole. With that in mind, let's begin. Their first argument is this idea that privatization undermines the scientific community. The assumption they make is that the profit motive itself is intrinsically harmful. First of all, we would tell you no, that is untrue, because this profit motive helps to create incentives to increase innovation and improve efficiency in the long term. But secondly, we tell you this profit motive is what creates scientific discovery and what makes scientific discoveries from the past applicable to the general market. Because these corporations want to profit, they're able to take things that have been discovered by NASA or by the ESA and make it applicable for the economy as a whole, so every person can benefit from it. Their second assumption in this argument is that privatization of space leads to less information sharing and less education. First of all, like Ella tells you, we don't prevent public space sectors from existing on our side of the house. We simply support the existence of the private sector. The government is still able to fund education. Colleges and universities can still fund research, and every single one of those benefits still exist on our side of the house. Secondly, private corporations work for the public good because that is the only way for them to profit. If it was true that they can just restrict access and not sell it to anyone, then they wouldn't earn any money on the market. The purpose of inventing new technologies is so they can sell it. They want accessibility because accessibility is what gains them profit in the first place. Thirdly, the public sector and the private sector work together. Like Ella tells you in our second substantive, which is largely unresponded to, these corporations and the public sector can work together to create better technologies and better research for the future. And finally, lastly, organizations like NASA and the ESA are held by political standards. If any of them were to be defunded, on Proposition's world, there will be no more avenues for education. On our side, we still have private corporations. But let's go on to their second argument, which talks about broad and societal harms. The assumption they make is that investing in space travel is horrible. But first of all, even if there is no research in space exploration, which we highly dispute because research is profitable, we still think this is beneficial because you are allowing for space travel and you are improving technology that the government currently uses. This helps to increase long-term benefits for the entire society. For example, like Ella tells you, SpaceX was able to cut the cost of ISS resupply missions by 10 times. This private innovation cuts costs and improves efficiency in the long term. It doesn't matter if Elon Musk is soaring in a jet halfway around the world. That's not an inherent harm. They have to prove that to you, and they haven't done so at all. But now let's extend Ella's arguments. Her first point is on innovation. Ella tells you that competition increases innovation and it decreases cost for consumers. The only response is that they don't support privatization on principle, because the medical sector, for example. But what we would tell you is that if you didn't support the privatization under the medical sector, thousands of life-saving drugs would never have been created. Millions of lives would never have been saved. The private sector creates innovation and helps those industries. But secondly, we also believe the government cannot be the only one who makes this research. Private corporations supplement government efforts. Private organizations are more cheap and more efficient, and they help people in the long term. That is very important. But secondly, our second argument about working with the government is largely unresponded to, because under our world, the government still exists. Every single one of their arguments is, oh, the government is a good actor. The government helps education. The government is a good way to help create space exploration. On our side, every one of these benefits still exists, but the private sector is able to help them cut costs, improve efficiency, and do this without the bureaucratic backlash that you would see under a government system. But before I move on to my third substantive, go.
Sure, in your world, the government still exists, but the fact that they subsidize and give contracts out to those companies means that taxpayers' money goes directly into the inactivity of the national space program and onto the profitable activities of the corporations.
Actually, taxpayer money is saved because now the government doesn't have to spend billions of dollars on every resupply mission. Like we tell you, we're able to cut costs. So if you care about the taxpayers, you support our side because private corporations in these private-public partnerships are better able to ensure that we cut costs and protect taxpayers. So with that in mind, let's move on to our third substantive argument, that privatized companies operate for the benefit of all of humanity. The first layer of analysis is that encouraging more investment in space exploration is important. Right now, humanity's problems have led to issues with inhabitability of the Earth. First of all, expanding populations have led to overcrowding issues. By the end of this century, this Earth will have 11 billion people, causing massive strains on resources like water and food. Under the current status quo, there is research going towards exploration of Mars, but that only exists with private corporations. Secondly, environmental destruction makes the planet less safe in the long term. A long-term solution that is becoming a more real possibility, and perhaps a necessity, is finding a way for humanity to live on another planet. The private sector is investing resources into finding cheap ways to get humanity onto Mars or onto other celestial bodies. But because their findings are able to push us forwards and have implications for years to come, we support them. With more people focusing on humanity's goal as a whole, we are more likely to find the solution. Furthermore, we believe that government institutions will prefer a certain type of person to carry on humanity to a different planet. They will want the fittest individual, the best suited to live on another planet. But we believe that private entities will not have this preference about which population deserves access to this opportunity. They are far more representative and they are far more diverse. Our second layer of analysis is that private companies are more likely to work with diverse personnel. Privatization opens the door to people who don't necessarily meet requirements that are set by national bureaucracies, by culture, or by tradition. Private companies look to find the best possible team that is going to accomplish goals as effectively and as efficiently as possible. They are likely to seek out people who simply are the most qualified, rather than those who conform to social or political standards. For example, we believe that the Russian space program is never going to send an openly gay astronaut into space, even if he is the most qualified person to do so. But because the private sector focuses on the actual merits of the individual, they are far better suited to do that. Private companies are more likely to recognize the value of having diverse opinions because it results in better problem solving and will actively search for a diverse group of people to be on their team. This results in an opportunity to benefit and to represent all of humanity. On the side of the opposition, we are not giving you a world where only private corporations exist. We give you a world where there is partnership, where there is cooperation, and where there is education. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he said this was a small step for mankind, but a big step for humanity. And today, we march forwards with that big step. We fight for the future, and that's why we oppose. Thank you.
Thank you to Rainan, and we call now Isa to continue the case for the proposition.
Okay. Yes, Neil. Oh. I am a midget, I'm very sorry. Thank you. Thank you. When Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, he said this is a very small step for man and a very large step for humanity. But if he was from a private company, I'm sure he'd said, great, we're here, let's mime the hell out of this place. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're really talking about in this debate. So when we were talking about today's debate and how it actually went, we have to first of all clarify one thing, right? We're talking about the regret of privatization, right? And we've given you extreme reasons why privatization in this sector specifically is problematic and why privatization of this kind of research is problematic as a whole. So first of all, let's talk about what their strategy actually was. So they said, we still have private and public cooperation, right? They said, well, you have to prove why this is exclusively bad. We say, firstly, it is bad because we believe it is undermining actual public works, right? When there is a lack of interest and a lack of pressure on the government to actually invest further on into their public space research, we have a huge problem here, right? Because they don't have the more and more funding, and that's problematic. That's why we believe they're actively being undermined by these private organizations. Secondly, we say that even if there is some sort of cooperation, we still think that we don't see any specific benefits that they brought for why the government couldn't do this themselves. First of all, they brought this idea that they're going to be so much more cost efficient and they're always going to be more efficient, but not really any particular analysis on why, right? They're still saying there's cooperation, they're still saying they are actually supported by the government. Why would they be any more cost efficient than governments competing against each other, right? The idea of cost efficiently and efficiently still exists, right? We still have some sort of competition against beside governments, right? We have China, for instance, currently competing with India for a better space organization. We don't really see why this is primarily on their side, right? Why is the idea of actually being cost efficient and very efficient on their side only on their side? They have never actually explained to you why private companies have a much better chance of becoming cost efficient than actual public organizations, right? Yes?
We told you that the cost incentive to compete with other contracts and clients drives prices down. When single space agencies dominate the entire market in an entire nation, that incentive doesn't exist. Please respond to the actual analysis we brought you.
First of all, we still see that there is this competition between actual countries, right? So even they have the ability to compete with each other, who is going to get the most benefits and who's going to get to a certain planet faster or whatever, right? There's still this kind of competition. So we don't see why this is exactly primarily. Yes, they have to compete, but we actually say this is terribly bad, right? Because we explained to you that in this case, and when we have governments, right, there is still some amount of actual cooperation between them. But when we have these private companies, this simply vanishes. And this is an extremely important and big field, right? When one company has the ability to get rockets and to actually help people get to a certain place or develop this new technology, right, they're not going to share that because yes, exactly, they're profit driven. But in this case, when we're talking about scientific breakthroughs, we believe that cooperation is also quite important, right? Yes, competition is a part of it, but also cooperation actually gets us better benefits for the humanity as a mankind, which they actually never responded to, right? When we're talking about cooperation in the international sphere and when we're talking about this idea that companies are secretive and are not going to share this information, this is not only a problem of developing good technology, but also of education, which they also didn't really go for. All right, so let's continue on to what they were talking about in like their second speaker, right? No, thank you. So they were saying how because they're private companies, they're more likely to take gay people up to space. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this seems like I'm paraphrasing, but their idea was that because these are private companies, they are going to be more likely to be more diverse. We really don't see any particular reason for that, right? They're saying that when these are private companies, more people are going to have the chance to get this. This is simply not true, right? What would we rather have? Rich people getting the benefits or everyone getting the benefits? And we really think that that is the most important part. And that is exactly why we're talking about public organizations, right? Why we're talking about public funding. That's why we believe that this is much more important, and we don't believe that this kind of difference is actually legitimate, right? We don't see them making this any more accessible, right? We have Virgin Galactic, these sort of programs when they're talking about space tourism, right? They're actually not going to take everyone up to space, right? They're only interested in the idea of being profit-driven, and that is extremely problematic because these kind of technologies are going to be much more expensive and much more problematic to get for the larger society. We believe that this is humanity's right to be able to share these kind of advancements, and we believe that that is simply not going to happen on the case on the side of opposition, right? Because we have these private companies and because taxpayers' money is going illegitimately into their hands. We believe that the public sector is completely capable of doing this on its own, and we have believed that it has been doing this on its own before 2004 very efficiently, and this is actually becoming more and more problematic in the status quo. So why do we actually regret it? Again, let's talk about our case and what we brought to you today. First of all, we have to understand that this is problematic out of the idea of research, right? We have to understand that as these private companies, which are very, very profit-driven, are not going to invest in research for the sake of research, right? They're going to invest in fields where they actually have an immediate draw of actually getting more profit, right? But the point of actual public funded programs is the fact that they are investing into directly research for the sake of bettering the knowledge of humanity, not for them to get profit, right? Because there's literally no incentive for private companies to actually invest into something that is purely for the sake of research. And that is extremely problematic because as they're taking legitimacy and pressure away from the governments to actually fund their own programs, they're actually not benefiting the research for the sake of research, the research for the sake of knowledge and expanding the knowledge of humanity. And that is extremely problematic, as I said so, right? We want the public sector to invest in this because they have more incentive to do the right things with it. They are not profit driven. They aren't going to be interested in how to mine Jupiter or whatever. They are going to be interested in how to explain, for instance, or take pictures of new galaxies and new stars and how to explain the scientific principles behind it. And also, furthermore, even if these companies are going to invest into this kind of research, we still say that this is not going to be accessible to everyone because there's simply no real reason for them to make it accessible to everyone. Actually, they have an incentive to make it inaccessible to their competitors and to the public because they're profit driven and they do not want this kind of information getting out. They want this to have a high price, and that is also problematic. That's why we still believe that public funded programs are much more efficient on the idea of actually providing knowledge and providing this kind of ideology, right? We also said that there is this undermining that is happening in the status quo, right? We believe that these government organizations are actually losing their legitimacy. legitimately, because people are in this belief that the private space agencies are doing enough, right? But we simply disagree, right? We believe that they are detrimental to the government's interest, and that they're, even when they have these kind of government and private companies cooperations, we believe that this is completely illegitimate for them to have. They're actually profiting of something the government could be and should be doing on its own, and actually benefiting the larger population. That's why we believe that there are more than enough reasons for actually regretting them. Because first of all, they're actually limiting the amount of knowledge that we could have from these kind of spheres, and they're also making it problematic for them to be accessible. And they're delegitimizing actual public-funded programs, which we believe are extremely important and which have actually led us to be in this point. That's why we believe today, ladies and gentlemen, that we take this debate.
Second, which side has the best impacts to the public sector? And the third, which side does the best to promote the general public good? Before I get into those three questions, let's start off with the major strategic errors they made in their construction of their case. Right from the beginning of the first proposition speech, there was a big misconception about what this debate was about that both Renan and Ella told you existed in their case. We told you that they completely misconstrued their burden because it wasn't enough for them to tell you that public sector space research and travel is just a good thing. They have to prove that it's so good to justify that private investment into space research and exploration should not exist altogether. At the point where they haven't done that, they can't win this debate. The only thing that they come up here in their latest speech was that really private sector involvement in space research and travel undermines public works. First of all, we think it's too late for them to make that assertion, but second of all, even if you don't buy that, we'll engage with it anyway when I get into the main points of clash. So let's go into the first main question that you have to ask yourself when evaluating the round, which is, which side best promotes efficiency and innovation? This is where pretty much the entirety of the first substantive argument brought forth by the proposition falls under. They tell you about the profit motives, deprivation of research and information, and how research will just not be invested in by private corporations because of a lack of a profit motive. We had a few responses that didn't go responded to, but that will extend and provide further rebuttal against. First of all, we told you that research actually is profitable. The reason why that's the case is because we already see a lot of companies in the status quo investing in research. If what they say is true and research isn't profitable, then those private companies like Land Space in China, like SpaceX, they would have never invested in research in the first place. At the point where there are tangible examples of research happening, that's a literal testament to the fact that research is profitable. Where have we seen this happen in the past? Look to the example of China with Land Space. We told you not only that they invested into research in rocket launchers to complement government programs, but that's just it. They complemented government programs to further innovation, to further efficiency in pursuing space exploration on the planet of Mars. What do we hear from the proposition? Really no engagement whatsoever. But second of all, we told you that if anything, thing, we actually foster more research, collaboration, and education on our side of the house in a world where private investment still exists in the space industry. Why is this the case? We tell you first of all that while they make the big assumption that governments don't also engage in secrecy for political reasons, there are literal examples. They tell you NASA hides technology and research from Russia all the time if it's even remotely militarily related with regards to space exploration. So there is, even though there is a profit incentive from private corporations, there's even bigger political motivations and bureaucratic inefficiencies that plague the public sector as well. The very institutions that they say should have sole ownership of the space industry. But then we think that really that doesn't stop the government from engaging in more open research. We still see transparency in research and innovation. We still think private companies are still adding value through the information they gain, even if it is marginally more secretive. But then that's where our analysis that we bring to you in our first two arguments is so important. Because if we manage to prove to you that innovation uniquely increases under competition, which can only be fostered in a world where private voices are included in space research and industry, then that is the only way you get those innovations to occur that ultimately benefit the public good, as I will elaborate on in the third clash point. Going into the second clash point, you ask yourself in the round about which side actually impacts the public sector better. Now, the only thing that they say against the impacts of the public sector is actually just brought up in their third speech about how private inclusion in the space industry crowds out public voices. We think it's a reprehensible tactic for them to introduce that argument this late in the debate, but we'll engage with it anyway. First of all, we think that governments operate to fulfill the public good, so to check private corporations, the governments will innovate too. We don't think they're going to just be crowded out. We already saw this in the medical industry. We don't really hear much engagement. But if anything, we think the reason why government programs are crowded out is not because the private sector is gaining more of a voice in space industry, because as we said, the private sector complements the government. The real reason why the government is being crowded out is because of their own budgetary constraints, their own bureaucratic inefficiencies, their own political agendas that literally force them to cut funding. Take the Trump administration as a prime example. To accommodate a $67 billion increase in military funding, what was one of the first things to go? NASA's budget. Is that a problem with private industry's inclusion? No, it's a problem with political agendas. Then go to the third question you ask yourself in this round, which is about which side best promotes the public good. And this is where I want to spend the most time on this speech, because that's the biggest stakeholder in this debate. What do we think the public good looks like? We think it looks like a few things. First, the dissemination of knowledge so that the everyday person can benefit. Second, the completion of space research and experiments that can eventually trickle down to help the public. What do we think this looks like? Already, corporations like SpaceX and Virgin Galactica are trying to increase their research and experimentation into things that require space to test, like the creation of drought-resistant crops. In a world where the private sector would not be able to participate in space research and travel, their voices, their innovations to ultimately help the public good would never be included. Now, the only thing that they say is that, well, the profit motive will decrease the likelihood that they'll essentially invest in this research and innovation. And they say that accessibility resultingly decreases. Remember the responses that Rainin tells you in his speech. The only reasons why private companies innovate, the only reasons why they research in the status quo is because it generates a profit. Private companies, for example, like SpaceX, would not invest in the creation of drought-resistant crop research if it didn't produce a profit and wouldn't help the public good. At the point where private companies are not just dedicated to making a profit, but also trying to protect their shareholders, that literally means that they are acting in the public's best interest, something that they again refuse to engage with. Then, we tell you finally that governments themselves are aided in a world where private companies participate in space research and travel. Why do we think this happened? I'll take you in a protected time. One of the biggest reasons as to why governments actually require more research and innovation from private enterprises is because it eases the burden on governments themselves. Why do we think this happens? We don't think the government's obligation is just to explore space the way these private space corporations' objective is. We think the government has the fundamental role to protect the variety of interests that their people need. So at that point, where government involvement in space industry literally takes away their ability to invest in other more important things, like preventing drought, preventing hunger, investing in their people, we definitely think that the inclusion of private sector companies in the space industry helps the government ease their burden and allow them greater flexibility to provide for the needs of their people. That's why we think we protect the public good while also increasing access to the innovations that come from private private sector space research and exploration. At the end of the day, it's because we're the only side that truly protects innovation and efficiency, fosters education while protecting government programs, while at the same time promoting the public good of all the people this motion applies to. That is why we're so proud to oppose.
And to conclude the debate for the opposition, if you can join me in welcoming back Ayla.
I genuinely wish that we lived in a world where government action alone could create freely accessible, incredibly advanced technologies in everything from medicine to space exploration. But that is not the world that we live in. Let's look at the comparative in today's round. In the world of the proposition, government programs bear the sole burden of engaging in beneficial research, developing travel technologies, even in the face of political challenges and budgetary constraints. In the world of the opposition, privatization helps governments actually decrease costs and focus on what they're good at. They engage in additional beneficial research, and yes, they do engage in things like research into space travel and engaging in research into resource extraction in extraplanetary bodies. We think that is incredibly beneficial. At best, the proposition's case has been a laundry list of reasons why government programs are beneficial compared to private programs. It has not been a case about why private programs are so horrible we ought to regret their entire existence. That's why the opposition takes today's debate. Two questions in this speech. First, we'll be asking which side is best for government space programs and which side is best for the public as a whole. Let's start with government space programs, which, as Nikhil tells you, were basically brought up in their third speech. They stated as little more than an assertion that government space programs are going to be somehow hurt by private corporations. We would tell you, and we've established, that these programs are declining for other reasons, and were actually declining long before 2004, as they pointed out, was when the private space industry really took off. And furthermore, they never responded to the argument that we brought you from first opposition about how this actually helps smaller governments, who may not be able to rely exclusively on their economic powerhouse level resources to develop their own space sector, but instead become home to a cast of multinational private space actors, as happens in Luxembourg, as happens in Australia, to allow them to expand their programs. But even if we take them at their highest ground and accept that funding for public programs is going to decrease a little bit, we would tell you that those losses are offset by the fact that the private sector is able to innovate more, is able to cut costs more, because they have the incentive to compete with one another for these government contracts. Nikhil very eloquently explains that governments never have to compete with one another in order to exist, they just do. So we allow the private sector to do what it is best at, to cut costs in the name of helping those public organizations. So we think that the public sector that they so forcefully advocate for is benefited on our side of the house, and that alone is the reason for us to take today's debate. But let's also consider the effect of privatization on the public good, which brings me to my next question on this very issue. They tell you that private space corporations do not engage in beneficial research that benefits all of humanity, completely ignoring what Rainin tells you in his second speech about how research will only be profitable if it benefits the public and is actually marketable. We would tell you that things like developing telescopes, even if it is with a partnership with a public entity, things like improving space travel research are all beneficial for the public. We don't think that just as in the medical industry, the government should have to go it alone, that they should have to go it alone as well when it comes to space exploration. But even if we accept that they don't engage in educational research, they essentially disparage this idea of private corporations only investing in space travel and space mining, and never tell us why that is so horrible. You can mock Elon Musk flying around in his space rocket all you want, but you don't actually tell us how that actually brings harm to people, and furthermore, we would tell you that by developing the technologies to allow Elon Musk to do that, you do the same for government entities, for people around the world. We absolutely believe in increasing innovation and increasing our ability to benefit all of humankind and reach for the stars, and that's why we are so proud to oppose. Thank you.
And to conclude this debate, please welcome Vasya.
I'm going to divide my reply speech into three major points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about research in itself and which side has more of that and more efficient research, more beneficial research. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how the private world actually undermines the ability of public space programs and national space agencies to function. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the accessibility of any product that is produced through the private sphere, through the private sector. So firstly, to the point of research. We believe that national space agencies research for the sake of societal benefits. They release new technologies, new scientific papers, and those things directly lead to social benefits. As we mentioned in our first speech already, NASA research has led to the development of prosthetic arms, prosthetic legs, limbs in general. We've had LED lights, which are now majorly in use all over the world, and those are the things that are deriving from those space agencies and from their work. On the other hand, when we have a private sector which is competition-based, as the side of opposition tells you throughout this entire debate, it is so fast-paced, it is so cost-efficient, but dear panel, this is exactly the reason why they cannot and do not focus on technologies that require long-term research, that require complex insight, because it's simply not worth it. Because the time they spend on researching things that will benefit the general society will not be profitable for them, because they're not going to be able to sell it as efficiently as when they develop rockets for commercial use. That's just simply how it is in the private sector, because the only thing in their eyes is short-term profit, and that is why SpaceX invests in rockets that people can hire for transport and not in deep space exploration and deep space research. The second point I want to address is the point about how the private world actually undermines the government programs and the space agencies. We give you multiple points of analysis, but the most important ones are the fact that the presence of the private sector itself, which is a major presence in the status quo, undermines and creates a lack of political support for government programs. Because when people see the private sector basically taking off, doing all of those things, they're all over the media, the government gets left behind. The government gets left in the dark, and that is why people also focus their finances and political capital onto those private sectors and not on the national research, the research that would actually benefit them in the end. Furthermore, we say that the government contracts that they're talking about throughout all of their speeches, and they say how beneficial they are because this is the government, the private programs actively supporting those government programs. We say no, what this is actually all about is the fact that those contracts directly translate to the fact that taxpayers' money is actively directed towards the private sector, not the national programs. This means that people are literally investing their taxes, the taxes that should go into their own protection within the society, into their well-being, into programs, for example, developing some satellite launchers for commercial use. This means that they're not contributing to the fact that those actors want to research, they're rather contributing to the greed of the private sector. But furthermore, to the last point, which side is actually more beneficial for the public sphere, for general society? We believe that the research for general society is super profitable. Those are the words of the side of the opposition. And they say clearly companies are going to engage in this research because researching for the sake of society is going to give them such immense amounts of money. But if we look at the status quo, why are they not doing that then? Why don't we see them focusing on research for society? Why do they spend 2,000 times more money on commercial satellite launches? We don't know. Maybe because it really isn't profitable. On the other hand, when we have the government sphere, their only and sole goal is to spend their budget, spend their money as efficiently as possible to create social implications, to create technologies and research that would actually develop mankind as a whole. Thank you.
If you can all join me in one last thank you to both teams for what was a great debate. Thank you very much, guys.
Please don't go anywhere. We'll continue immediately.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So while the CA panel or the judging panel adjudicates, we're going to announce the 10 best speakers of the tournament. So stay in the room, please. Okay. So the speakers were ranked according to average, and if the average was the same, according to a high-low ranking. And we actually have an exact match on rank 10 with exact same average and high-low scores. So the two 10th best speakers, and I apologize in advance for mispronouncing names. The two 10th best speakers of this tournament are Ranin Miao and Davis Colley. Davis Colley? Okay. The 9th best speaker of this tournament, Loren Seldarovic. Please join me so you can get a word thingy. Oh, okay. If she comes, tell me, so we'll do her later. Okay. 8th best speaker, Marco Casun. Seventh best speaker, Vasya Groshev. Okay, 6th best speaker, Piper Doyle. Can I get one more applause for Loren Seldarovic? Vasya je tako šel. Aha, okay. 5th best speaker, Shreya Agarwala. Fourth best speaker of this tournament, Iza Yerman. Okay, and now the top three. Third best speaker, Noah Hines. Second best speaker, Ella Michalis. And the best speaker of the International World Schools Debate Tournament here in Ljutomer is Nikhil Ramaswamy. Okay, can you have one big round of applause for all the best speakers? And now we await the judging panel for the final decisions and the team awards. Thank you.
Okay, so the time has come for us to announce who wins an award for taking the hashtag idtl the furthest. We couldn't actually decide who gets the award, so we decided to choose two winners. The first award for the most posts decorated with hashtag idtl goes to Dorotea from Slovenia. Congratulations, please join me on the stage. The second award for the most original post goes to Krista from Hungary. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Sam stoji, da naredimo pač team. So before we announce the winners of the finals, there's one more task we need to go through. And we're going to give awards out to the teams that reached the out rounds. So special awards for quarterfinalists and semifinalists. So starting with quarterfinalist teams, we'd like to call Bežigrad Golden Stars. We'll just continue on so this doesn't take too long. Next team, USA Blue. Klasična, also quarterfinalist. And last and not least of the quarterfinalists, Turkey B. Okay, now for the semi-finalists. The first team to reach the semi-final, DGM Blue. And the second semi-finalist team, US Everglades.
And thus ends my expectant looking at Ivan for all of the answers. Okay, right. Well, I think we can all agree that that was a really fitting and international end to what has been a truly international week. We had a great panel of judges helping me out. So we have Ela Jurko and Luka Bakovic, both from Croatia, John Tomlinson from England, and Anna-Sophie Zajpikis, sorry, from Germany, who we had an interesting discussion about the debate that we saw. And it was a 4-1 split, which I think shows that when each of us were deliberating, we saw a lot of really interesting argumentation that was brought forward by both teams. We thought it was a really stylistic debate, and hopefully you guys were transported into this world of international space travel, and your interest has been piqued. But at the end of the day, we felt that this essentially came down to content and a strategic choice. And the majority of the panel simply felt that one of the teams had done a better job in developing their arguments further. They were slightly more linked back to a continuous proof as to why their arguments meant that they were actually winning the debate. So we really had an impact linked specifically back to the motion that was being discussed. So congratulations to the opposition on a 4-1 split. And a lot of recognition to our other finalist team who are our runners-up. And we have 1 out of 3 isn't bad to keep around. The rest of them are... The rest of them are off celebrating their education or some kind of thing that's clearly not quite as important as debating. But no, thank you again to all of the teams that came and competed. Thank you to your coaches. But can we also just give a huge thank you to Liana, who has been organizing this for the last time again, and to the high school that keeps on having us back every single year. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here, and obviously you've all had a wonderful time. So let's give them a huge thank you for letting them use the school as well.
Sorry, I didn't come here for an applause. I just wanted to say on behalf of Gimnazija Franca Miklošića Ljutomer and on behalf of the whole teaching staff and the students, we really enjoyed having you here and we are looking forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you.